You can't fix what you don't understand, the old man said quietly, but no one on the flight line was listening. The afternoon heat shimmered above the concrete at Fort Holloway, bending the air around a silent UH-1 Huey that refused to come alive, its rotor blades hanging limp like tired wings while a circle of mechanics in crisp coveralls stood around it with crossed arms and fading patience. Ryan Cole, lead mechanic, 26, top of his class and fully aware of it, kicked the landing skid with the flat of his boot, the dull metallic thud echoing louder than it should have in the heavy stillness, and shook his head with a smirk that drew a few tired laughs from the crew. 6 hours, he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, including the cluster of officers watching from the shaded briefing tent 50 yards away. 6 hours, 3 diagnostic systems, and a direct line to the manufacturer, and this thing still won't start. But yeah, I'm sure the old guy's got the answer. A ripple of amusement passed through the group, low and easy, the kind that comes when frustration turns into mockery just to fill the space. A few yards away, standing alone near the edge of the tarmac, Eli Thompson didn't react. He wore a faded olive jacket that had seen better decades, denim worn soft at the knees, and boots that had long ago stopped trying to look new. His hands rested in his pockets, his posture relaxed but unmoving, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the men, but on the helicopter itself, as if the machine were speaking in a language no one else could hear. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks approached him with measured steps, the stiffness of fresh authority evident in every movement, his uniform sharp, his expression controlled but impatient. "Sir," he said, the word polite but empty, "this is a restricted maintenance zone. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Eli's gaze shifted slowly, meeting the lieutenant's eyes with a calm that felt out of place in the rising tension, then drifted back to the Huey without a word. Behind them, Ryan let out a short laugh and wiped his hands on a rag. "Lieutenant, you might want to keep him farther than that," he called out, loud enough to carry, "wouldn't want him breaking something we actually fixed." More laughter followed, sharper this time, drawing attention from a few airmen nearby who paused just long enough to watch before moving on. The helicopter sat unchanged, silent, stubborn, every system on the diagnostic screens reading green, every test returning perfect, and yet the engine refused to turn over, a contradiction none of them could explain. The pressure was building, though no one said it out loud. In less than 10 minutes, that aircraft was supposed to be airborne for a demonstration flight, and failure wasn't an option anyone wanted to explain. Eli took a slow step forward, just one, his boots scraping lightly against the concrete, the sound almost lost under the distant hum of generators and the faint rattle of tools. Ryan noticed and raised a hand, palm out, stopping him like a barrier. "Hey," he said, the humor gone now, replaced by something sharper, "don't touch anything, old man. You'll just make it worse." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, heavier than intended, and for a moment, everything seemed to settle into a strange, expectant quiet, as if even the wind had paused to see what would happen next. Eli didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked at the helicopter, his expression unchanged, his eyes tracing lines across the fuselage, the engine housing, the small details everyone else had already dismissed. And somewhere in that silence, beneath the hum of equipment and the fading echoes of laughter, it felt like he was listening to something none of them could hear. The silence stretched just long enough to make the tension uncomfortable, like a held breath no one wanted to release, and then the faint crackle of a radio broke it as one of the junior mechanics read off another line of diagnostic results that sounded just as perfect and just as useless as the last, every system green, every reading within tolerance, and still the helicopter refused to respond, its engine cold, its presence almost defiant against the growing urgency around it. Ryan exhaled sharply through his nose and glanced toward the briefing tent where a pair of officers were now checking their watches, their posture tightening with each passing second, and he felt the pressure settle heavier on his shoulders even as he tried to shrug it off with another smirk. "Run it again," he said, gesturing toward the laptop as if repetition alone might force a different outcome, and when the same result came back, unchanged, he let out a low laugh that did not quite hide the edge in his voice. "Amazing. A perfect machine that does absolutely nothing." Lieutenant Brooks shifted his weight, his earlier confidence thinning into visible frustration, and he looked back at Eli, who had not moved more than a few inches since being told to step away, still watching, still silent, his eyes following something along the engine housing that no one else seemed to notice. Sir, Brooks said again, firmer this time, I am asking you one last time to clear the area. Eli did not answer right away. He took another slow step, just enough to bring him within arm's reach of the helicopter's side panel, and for a brief moment, the mechanic stiffened as if expecting him to do something reckless, but he did not touch it. Not yet. He just looked, head tilted slightly, listening with that same quiet focus that made the air around him feel different, heavier, as if the noise of the flight line had dulled at the edges. Ryan stepped forward quickly, closing the distance, his boot scraping hard against the concrete. I said do not touch it, he snapped, the humor gone now, replaced by irritation that had been building under the surface. You think we missed something? We have run every check there is. This is not some old field repair situation. This is real diagnostics. Eli's gaze finally shifted to him, steady and calm, and for a second, Ryan felt something he could not quite name, a flicker of doubt that vanished as quickly as it came. You checked what the system told you to check, Eli said, his voice low and even, carrying just enough to cut through the surrounding noise without rising. That is not the same thing as listening. A few of the mechanics exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or stay quiet, and one of them let out a short chuckle that died almost immediately when no one joined in. Ryan shook his head, dismissive, but the tightness in his jaw gave him away. Listen to what, exactly? He asked, spreading his hands toward the helicopter. It is not exactly talking. Eli turned his attention back to the aircraft, his eyes settling on a small access panel just below the engine cowling, barely noticeable unless someone knew where to look. It is, he said softly. You just have to know how. The words landed differently this time, not as a challenge, not as a joke, but as something else entirely, and somewhere behind them, an airman named Jake Miller had been watching the entire exchange, his brow furrowed, a quiet unease building in his chest as he looked from the silent helicopter to the old man who seemed to see something none of them could, and for the first time that afternoon, the certainty on the flight line began to crack. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it spread across the flight line like a change in pressure before a storm, and the laughter that had once filled the space was now gone, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, as Eli stepped closer to the helicopter and stopped beside the small access panel he had been watching. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as if he were reading something written in metal and silence, his head tilting just enough to catch the faintest detail that everyone else had overlooked. Ryan folded his arms tightly across his chest, trying to hold onto the authority he had built all afternoon, but there was hesitation now, a fraction of a second where he did not speak, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. You are wasting time, he said finally, though the words lacked the earlier confidence, and he glanced again toward the officers in the distance, their presence now heavier, their expectations unspoken but unmistakable. We have already checked that section. The system shows no fault there. Eli nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than responding to Ryan. That is the problem, he said. You trusted the system. The word settled into the air with a quiet weight, and for a moment no one answered, because no one was entirely sure how to. Lieutenant Brooks stepped forward again, his patience wearing thin under the pressure of the ticking clock. Sir, I am ordering you to step away, he said, his tone sharper now, the edge of authority returning as he reached for something solid to stand on. Eli did not move. Instead, he lifted one hand, steady but deliberate, and rested it lightly against the side of the helicopter, his fingers brushing the metal with a familiarity that felt out of place in a space ruled by procedures and protocols. The contact was brief, almost nothing, but it changed something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, like hearing a voice after years of silence. The world around him seemed to dim at the edges, the bright afternoon light fading into something older, heavier, and for a split second the quiet hum of generators gave way to the distant echo of rotor blades cutting through thick air, the memory so vivid it almost carried sound with it, the rhythm steady, urgent, alive. He blinked once, and the present snapped back into place, the heat, the concrete, the silent helicopter in front of him. This panel, he said, tapping it gently with 2 fingers, was it opened? Ryan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not reach his eyes. No, he said. There was no reason to. The diagnostics show everything behind it is functioning perfectly. Opening it would break a sealed system for no fault condition. That is not how this works. Eli looked at him again, calm, unwavering. That is exactly how this works, he replied. The certainty in his voice did not rise, did not push, but it held, steady and unshaken, and that was what made it harder to dismiss. A few of the mechanics shifted their weight, exchanging glances that carried more doubt than before, and behind them, Jake felt the unease tighten in his chest as he watched the exchange, something about the old man's calm cutting through the noise of training and procedure. He stepped back slightly, his hand moving toward his pocket without fully committing, his eyes flicking toward the command building at the far end of the tarmac. He did not know exactly what was wrong, only that something was, and that the man everyone had been dismissing might be the only one who understood it. The helicopter remained silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like it was waiting. The tension finally snapped into motion when Jake Miller turned away from the group, his decision quiet but firm, his boots moving faster than before as he headed toward the far edge of the tarmac where the signal was stronger, his hand already pulling his phone free as his mind raced through the chain of command he had been taught never to bypass, and yet something told him this was not a moment for hesitation. Behind him, the confrontation held steady like a loaded spring, Ryan still standing between Eli and the helicopter, arms crossed, jaw tight, his authority now more defensive than confident as he watched the old man with growing irritation. "We are not opening that panel," Ryan said, slower this time, as if repeating it would make it absolute. "There is no fault there. You do not tear into a sealed system based on a guess." Eli did not argue. He simply rested his hand again against the metal, his fingers tracing the edge of the panel, feeling something that did not show up on any screen, something that did not need numbers to exist. "It is not a guess," he said quietly. "It is a memory." The word lingered, unfamiliar in a space filled with data and checklists, and for a moment even Lieutenant Brooks hesitated, his authority colliding with something he did not fully understand. "Memory does not apply here," Brooks said, though his voice lacked the sharpness it once had. "Procedure does." Eli nodded once, accepting the statement without agreeing with it, his eyes never leaving the panel. "Procedure keeps things consistent," he said. "Experience keeps them alive." The mechanics shifted again, the earlier certainty now fractured into something less stable, and one of them glanced at Ryan as if waiting for a stronger response, but Ryan did not speak right away. He looked at the helicopter, then at the panel, then back at Eli, and for a brief second, doubt flickered across his face before he forced it away. "You are not touching it," he said again, more firmly, stepping closer as if to physically enforce the boundary. The air tightened, the moment stretching thin, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a vehicle engine approached, unnoticed by most but not by Eli, whose eyes lifted slightly toward the far end of the runway before returning to the helicopter. He did not step back. He did not push forward. He simply waited, his stillness more unyielding than any argument. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last, and the silent helicopter sat at the center of it all, unchanged, unmoved, as if it too were waiting for something beyond the reach of diagnostics and rank. Then, from the far side of the tarmac, the low growl of an approaching command vehicle cut through the heat, growing louder with each passing second, and the shift it brought was immediate, subtle but undeniable. As heads turned, conversation stopped, and the fragile balance on the flight line began to tilt toward something none of them had planned for. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew from a distant hum into a steady, commanding presence, its tires rolling across the concrete with purpose, and as it came into view, the shift across the flight line became immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, backs straightened, and even Ryan's posture adjusted without him realizing it, his arms dropping slightly as his attention was pulled away from Eli and toward the source of authority now arriving unannounced. The vehicle slowed as it neared the helicopter, dust swirling lightly in its wake, and when it came to a stop, the door opened with a sharp metallic click that seemed louder than it should have been in the heavy air. A colonel stepped out first, his movements quick, precise, his expression already tense as his eyes scanned the scene and locked onto the silent helicopter, then shifted to the group surrounding it, taking in the tension, the uncertainty, and finally the presence of the old man standing closest to the aircraft. He did not speak immediately. He did not need to. The weight of his rank settled over the group like a sudden drop in temperature. "Status," he said, his voice controlled, direct, leaving no room for anything but a clear answer. Ryan stepped forward, instinctively reclaiming his role, though the confidence from earlier had thinned. "Sir, all systems are reading normal, but the engine will not engage," he said, choosing his words carefully now. "We are running additional diagnostics." The colonel's gaze flicked briefly to the laptop screens, then back to the helicopter, and finally to Eli, who had not moved, who did not react to the arrival, who simply stood there as if the change in authority meant nothing to him. "And him?" the colonel asked, a slight tilt of his head indicating Eli without fully turning. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Civilian, sir," he said. "He is interfering with the maintenance process." The word hung in the air, heavier than intended. And for the first time, a faint crease appeared in the colonel's expression as he looked more closely at Eli, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if searching his memory for something just out of reach. Eli met his gaze, calm, steady, and said nothing. The moment stretched, quiet but charged, and then the colonel turned back to Ryan. "We do not have time for interference," he said. "You have 5 minutes." The statement landed like a countdown, sharp and final, and the pressure that had been building all afternoon surged all at once, tightening every movement, every breath. Ryan nodded quickly, already turning back toward the helicopter, issuing short, clipped instructions to his team, his voice louder now, trying to regain control, but beneath it all, the uncertainty remained, a crack that would not close. Eli watched it all without speaking, his attention drifting once more to the small access panel, his fingers brushing the edge again, feeling the same subtle inconsistency, the same quiet resistance that no sensor had reported. Behind the colonel, the vehicle door opened again, slower this time, and a second figure stepped out, taller, older, his presence carrying a different kind of weight, one that did not need to announce itself. Conversations did not just stop this time. They disappeared entirely, replaced by a stillness that spread across the flight line in an instant, as if everyone understood, all at once, that something far more significant had just entered the scene. The second man stepped fully into the light, and the effect was immediate, like a current passing through the entire flight line at once, straightening spines, silencing movement, pulling every eye toward him without a single word being spoken, his uniform carrying the unmistakable weight of command that did not need introduction, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere from urgency to something sharper, something absolute. General Carter Hayes did not rush. He moved with deliberate calm, his gaze sweeping once across the helicopter, then the mechanics, then the colonel, and finally settling on Eli Thompson, where it stayed a fraction longer than expected, as if confirming something already known rather than discovering it. The colonel stepped slightly aside, his posture tightening even further, and spoke in a lower voice than before. "Sir, we are experiencing a startup failure. The team is working the issue." The general gave a small nod, but his eyes did not leave Eli. "Are they?" he asked quietly, and the question was not directed at the colonel, nor at the mechanics, but seemed to exist on its own, hanging in the air with a weight that made no one eager to answer. Ryan felt it immediately, the shift from being in charge of the problem to being evaluated by something far beyond his control, and he stepped forward again, his voice careful, measured, stripped of the earlier sarcasm. "Sir, all systems are operational according to diagnostics. We are isolating the fault now." The general's gaze moved to him briefly, sharp, assessing, then back to Eli. "And yet it does not start," he said, not as a question, but as a fact that carried its own judgment. The silence that followed pressed in from all sides, the hum of the bass fading into the background, the only sound now the faint ticking of cooling metal under the afternoon sun. Eli stood exactly where he had been, unchanged by the arrival, his hand still resting lightly against the helicopter, his attention fixed on that same small panel. He did not salute. He did not speak first. He simply acknowledged the general with the slightest shift of his gaze, a quiet recognition that carried no ceremony but held a depth that did not go unnoticed. General Hayes took one step closer, stopping just within arm's reach of the aircraft, his eyes following Eli's line of sight to the panel, and for a moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them different from the rest, not tense, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if both understood something the others did not. "How long has it been silent?" the general asked, his voice low, steady. Ryan answered quickly, almost automatically. "Approximately 6 hours, sir." The general nodded once, still looking at the panel. "That is too long for a machine that wants to fly," he said softly. Ryan hesitated, unsure how to respond to that, and the uncertainty spread again, visible now in the way the mechanics shifted, in the way Lieutenant Brooks stood a little straighter without knowing why. The general's gaze returned to Eli. "What do you see?" he asked. It was the first direct question, and it landed with a precision that cut through everything else. Eli did not answer immediately. He tapped the edge of the panel once, gently. The sound soft but distinct in the quiet. "Something they did not open," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that made the air feel heavier, as if the moment had reached a point where it could no longer be held back, where something was about to change, and everyone on the flight line felt it, even if they did not yet understand why. The air tightened to a point where even the smallest movement felt amplified, and for a moment no one spoke, no one shifted, as if the entire flight line had paused at the edge of a decision that did not belong to them anymore, and then Ryan cleared his throat, the sound sharper than intended, trying to reclaim something of his earlier certainty. "Sir," he said, addressing the general but glancing at Eli, "that panel has been verified. There is no indication of failure behind it. Opening it would compromise a sealed system without cause." The words were technically correct, structured, safe, and for a second they seemed to hang there with enough authority to matter, but General Hayes did not respond immediately. He looked at Ryan, really looked this time, weighing not just the words but the confidence behind them, the reliance on systems, the absence of something less measurable. Then his gaze shifted back to Eli, and whatever calculation had been running behind his eyes settled into stillness. "Open it," he said. The command was quiet, almost understated, but it carried with it an absolute that erased any room for argument. Ryan froze, just for a fraction of a second, his mind catching up to what had just been said, and when it did, he hesitated. It was not defiance. It was something more dangerous in a place built on certainty. Doubt. "Sir, I recommend we continue with diagnostics," he said carefully, his voice lower now, more controlled. "We are within protocol, and there is no confirmed fault in that section." The general did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. He simply held Ryan's gaze, steady and unyielding, and in that silence, the weight of command became undeniable. "Open it," he said again, exactly the same, but this time there was no mistaking it. The moment broke. Ryan nodded once, tight, controlled, and stepped back, gesturing sharply to one of the mechanics. "Tools," he said, and the word came out faster than he intended, betraying the shift that had already taken place. A toolbox was brought forward, the metallic clink of instruments suddenly loud in the quiet, and the mechanic crouched beside the panel, hands moving quickly but not as confidently as before, each bolt turning with a faint resistance, each second stretching longer than it should have. Eli did not move closer. He did not instruct. He simply watched, his eyes fixed on the panel as it was finally loosened, the seal breaking with a soft, almost reluctant sound that seemed to echo across the space. When the panel came free, it revealed a compact section of wiring and components that looked, at first glance, exactly as the diagnostics had described. Clean. Intact. Perfect. Ryan exhaled slowly, almost relieved, as if the visible confirmation might restore the order he had relied on all day. "There," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "No issue." Eli stepped forward then, just one step, and knelt beside the open panel, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time had shifted to match his pace. He leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the components, not searching broadly but focusing on something precise, something small, something that did not belong. His hand moved, not to the center where everything looked perfect, but to the edge, to a single connection point barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look, and he paused there, his fingers hovering just above it. "It is not broken," he said softly. "It is misaligned." The words landed with a quiet certainty, and before anyone could respond, he reached in and adjusted the piece with a movement so small it almost did not register, a subtle shift, a fraction of an inch, a correction that took less than a second. Then he withdrew his hand and stood, stepping back without another word. "Try it," he said. No one moved at first. The silence returned, heavier now, charged with something new, something on the edge of release, and then Ryan looked at the helicopter, then at the panel, then at the general, and finally gave a short nod to the mechanic at the controls. "Start sequence," he said, his voice quieter than before, but steady, as if bracing for whatever came next. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, and that silence felt louder than anything that had come before it, stretching across the tarmac like a held breath that refused to release. Every eye locked onto the helicopter as the mechanic inside followed the start sequence, hands moving with careful precision over switches and controls that had already failed them countless times that day. Ryan stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed forward, his jaw tight, as if any movement might break whatever fragile moment had formed, while Lieutenant Brooks shifted slightly beside him, his earlier authority replaced by something quieter, something closer to anticipation. General Hayes did not move at all. His posture remained steady, his attention fixed not on the cockpit, but on the helicopter as a whole, as if he were listening for something beyond sound. Eli stood a few steps back now, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged, his role already complete, as if what came next did not belong to him anymore. Then, a faint click broke through the silence, followed by a low electrical hum that had not been there before, subtle at first, almost easy to miss, but unmistakably different from the stillness that had defined the machine for hours. The mechanic glanced down at the panel, then back at the instruments, his movement slowing as something began to respond. A second sound followed, deeper this time, the initial stir of the engine catching, not fully, but enough to shift the air around it, and the change rippled outward, felt before it was fully heard. Ryan's eyes widened just slightly, the reaction controlled but real, and he took one step forward without realizing it, drawn in by the sound. The hum grew stronger, layering into a steady vibration that traveled through the frame of the helicopter, into the ground, into the boots of everyone standing nearby, and then the engine engaged fully, the rotor beginning to turn with a slow, deliberate motion that built with each passing second, the blades cutting into the air, gathering speed, gathering life. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. What had been silent and inert was now alive, the machine responding exactly as it was meant to, as if the failure had never existed at all. No one spoke. No one needed to. The sound filled the space, rising into a steady rhythm that pushed everything else aside, and in that moment, the entire flight line stood still, not out of discipline, but because there was nothing left to say. Ryan lowered his hand slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders in a way that felt unfamiliar, his earlier confidence replaced by something else entirely, something quieter, heavier. He looked at the open panel, then at Eli, then back at the helicopter, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew. Lieutenant Brooks took a half step back, his eyes fixed on the spinning rotor, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between disbelief and realization. The mechanics who had laughed before now stood silent, their earlier certainty gone, replaced by a stillness that carried its own kind of respect. General Hayes watched it all without expression, his gaze steady, as the helicopter settled into a smooth, steady operation, the sound now consistent, controlled, exactly as it should have been from the start. And in the space between that sound and the silence that had come before it, something had shifted permanently, something no diagnostic system could measure, but everyone present could feel. The rotor settled into a steady rhythm above them, the sound no longer rising but holding, strong and consistent, filling the air with a presence that had been missing all afternoon, and yet no one moved to celebrate it, no one spoke to claim it, because the moment did not belong to noise. It belonged to what had just been revealed. Ryan stood there for a long second, watching the helicopter as if it might stop again, as if what he had witnessed needed to be tested one more time to be believed, but it did not falter, it did not hesitate, it simply ran, smooth and certain, as though it had never been silent at all. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than he expected, and when he turned, his eyes went to Eli without thinking, the distance between them now feeling very different from before. There was no smirk left, no trace of the earlier dismissal, only a quiet recognition that settled in without needing words. Lieutenant Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, adjusting his posture in a way that felt more grounded, less performative, as if something about authority had shifted for him in a way he could not yet explain. Around them, the mechanics who had filled the space with laughter now stood back, hands still, eyes forward, not instructed to do so, but choosing it all the same, their silence carrying more weight than any apology could have. General Hayes remained where he was, watching the helicopter for a moment longer before his attention returned to Eli, and when it did, there was no question in his expression, no doubt, only a quiet certainty that needed no confirmation. He took one step forward, just enough to close the space, and gave the slightest nod, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking directly at it, but it held a depth of respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. Still listening, the general said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the steady chop of the rotor, and Eli gave a faint nod in return, nothing more, nothing less, as if the exchange was complete in that single moment. No introductions were made. No records were checked. None of it was necessary. The truth had already revealed itself in the only way that mattered. The colonel stood quietly to the side, his earlier urgency replaced by a composed stillness, understanding now that the situation had been resolved long before any official process could have addressed it. Ryan glanced once more at the open panel, then reached down and secured it carefully, his movement slower now, more deliberate, as if he understood that what he had missed was not a failure of effort, but something else entirely, something that could not be measured on a screen. When he finished, he stepped back without a word, giving space not out of instruction, but out of instinct. Eli turned then, not toward the helicopter, not toward the officers, but toward the open stretch of tarmac beyond them, his pace unhurried, his presence already fading back into the quiet place he had come from, leaving behind nothing but a machine that worked and a silence that said everything. And as the sound of the rotor carried across the base, steady and unbroken, the lesson remained where no one could ignore it, not written, not spoken, but understood all the same, that respect is not commanded by rank or proven by noise, it is earned in moments when no one is watching, and remembered long after the moment has passed.